management. All over to you. I'll mute out.
Okay, thanks, Chris, and good morning, all. Yeah, there's a little bit of showers around most of the cropping areas in recent times. So, you know, prospects are moving forward, even though the Bureau of Met have probably downscaled their enthusiasm from the season from you know, average to considerably better than average to just better than average to average, but still, you know, the potential is there for them to be wrong, and we've just got to stay on top of management. And as Chris said, you know, we're aware that throughout Eastern Australia, there is a large range of conditions as far as soil nutrient supply as a result of various failures or successes in the past couple of seasons, and as a result of the autumn rain that came late relatively and has affected just the particularly the nitrogen situation in the soil. Just reading back at some of John Angus's old materials and some other more recent stuff indicating you get the rain at the right time of season when it's still warm enough. It's steamed up with some nice fresh labile organic matter, then rates of 14 to 15 kilograms of nitrogen per week showing up under ideal conditions is not unimaginable. So things can change very rapidly once we get moisture, heat, and some labile nitrogen in the system. And by and large, that might have been after people soil tested, or they decided they wanted to plant before they did any real assessment of the crop. And they're going to move forward and try and manage in crop, and that's why the reason for this webinar. Look, just before I start, I just want to put forward an analogy, because in crop nutrient, particularly when we're talking about plant tissue hasn't been a favourite subject for a lot of people. It's a bit nefarious as far as they're concerned about how to interpret it. And, you know, to me, it's like finding a pot of gold. If you understand how to go about the process, then can be some quite huge benefits from it in identifying opportunities where we can do a lot better. So my analogy comes down to finding $1 million. And it's somewhere on the farm and it's somewhere in a paddock, but you don't know where it is. Now, how are you going to guide yourself to that unless you're asking a set of questions of somebody about the location? And the first question might be, which paddock is it in? Well, that's useful in finding the gold a bit more easily. There's $1 million there, and you want to find it as quickly as possible because someone else might grab it. And by asking the right questions, then we end up closer to the goal. The next thing goes, okay, we know it's in that paddock, but if I've got to dig up all of that paddock to find it, it's going to take me an age, it's going to cost me a lot of money. What extra information do I need to get me closer, faster? And I'd say, if I gave you a transect like that and said, okay, there's another point, and if you draw a straight line, it's somewhere on there. Now, that gets you there a bit more quickly. It eliminates a whole heap of places that it isn't, but it doesn't tell you where it is. So 2 pieces of information may not be enough to solve the puzzle. So the next piece of information, I say, okay, where is it from the starting point you gave me? And if I get that bit of information, it basically says, okay, I know approximately where it is, but I've got another dimension there is, I know where it is on the surface, but if it's buried, is it, you know, a mile deep? Is it about a foot deep? I can't see it. It's buried there somewhere. So the last dimension that gets me, it basically took me 4 bits of information to get to the gold. And that's what we're really talking about when we're talking about in-crop and differential diagnosis of which plant tissue testing is one part. So it doesn't exist by itself. It is not the golden answer. It fits in with a whole heap of information that helps eliminate other possibilities and make sure we keep on track. So, you know, it comes down to the old 6 Ps adage. If you don't plan, you end up with piss poor performance. Pardon the French, but that's a fact. If you go out and expect plant tissue testing to be the golden thing without doing any planning about where it fits into it, then you're going to have poor results, and you'll probably give it up the first time you use it because it doesn't seem to make sense or add any information. But if it's put into the right context, it can put you on the money a lot quicker than without it. So what are the considerations? What do we need to know to go in with it? The more the better. And as I said there, if I gave you 4 extra bits of information to find that gold rather than just which paddock it was in, then you can get on the money very, very quickly. So, and the same goes with plant testing or any in-crop assessment, whether that be just symptoms, diagnosing symptoms. You've got to know the background and gather the information to eliminate all of the things that is and it isn't. So, you know, here's a list here. I'll put down the important considerations when we're talking about, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about in-crop nitrogen testing. There's still probably people that may be thinking of doing that, testing the soil, particularly for nitrogen and maybe sulfur at this stage, and talk about plant tissue testing. So, you know, the important things are previous crop performance. Things like yield and protein, even better if you've got a yield and protein map. There's a lot more to that than's being necessarily touted by the people that actually sell the instruments. There's a lot more that can be got out of that information if we understand what it's telling us about where to sample and how to interpret it. You know, we've got things like flag leaf NDVI. If we have an NDVI from flag leaf from the previous crop, then it adds to the information. If we've got NDVI information from this year to say the symptoms are back, then it's something we can rely on as a sampling point. Other indices like net primary productivities, a whole heap of things from space and from drones that we can now use out of previous crop performance. And if we've got that information, we're all the better about what's happening this season. Soil test results, yes, no. Is there a soil test information prior to this to go with it to say all the other nutrients are adequate, the pH is okay? Because if we're going to do something in crop, we need to know those things that we can't change in crop are okay. Otherwise, it's going to change our options and how hard we go with any in-crop options, knowing that there is a constraint there that we can't fix. So do we have soil test results? What have we done about them? Fallow season conditions, particularly in relation to around the soil testing time. If did we soil test before the fallow soil conditions changed or after? So what were the rainfall patterns? How did that affect mineralization and immobilization? What's the stored soil water status? And from that, what's the yield potential? And the yield potential is established not only by the rainfall there, but what was the establishment date of the crop? What's the plant population? What's the outlook for weeds and disease? And once we get to in-crop, what do we know about the rate of tiller formation? Is it slow? Is it rapid for the variety that we're planting? Because they can be all hints to something's going wrong. We need to look further. What nutrients have been added to date? And ultimately, when we make a decision, it's got to be in the light of what is the practical application considerations. I can't really say to you know, to the customer to do something if you really can't do it. Yeah, that's one for next season if it might occur again. So as far as those background information is very useful for both deep in-crop N and plant tissue. And they're the sort of things I tick off in my mind when someone asks me about what should I do. Well, these are the sorts of areas I've got to get some sort of feeling for in questioning the situation to frame the answer to, if I do a deep in-crop N, what should I do? And because some of the things that are in here are not necessarily taken into account in the way that you would interpret it. For both deep in-crop N and plant tissue. As far as yield tracking potential, you know, this is a new one that's out there, Graincast. Yield Profit's been around for a while. But these are, you know, great tools to keep us in the view of what's happening as far as the soil's concerned. Now, yeah, it is district related to some degree, and it is modelled. but it's giving a feel for the range. And, you know, in this case, this one's for, you know, central southern New South Wales. You know, it's suggesting without anything other than rainfall constraints and the normal season, we're looking around 6 to 7 tonnes per hectare potential right now. This was updated on the 10th of June. So, you know, that's in the back of our mind saying, okay, well, the stored soil moisture is at 92% of capacity. Given that there's no other constraints I'm aware of, this is where we are at the moment as far as yield potential. That's in the back of my mind is, you know, we've got quite a bit of upside. We've got some downside, but quite a bit of upside. Am I planning there, and am I keeping my options open should the rainfall go with us for that sort of yield potential for that site going forward? So what tools have we got? You know, I suppose we've got rules of thumb that are out there, but we've also got objective measurement of things. And I wanted to talk more about the objective measurement and particularly those things that we can use in crop. So we've probably used a range of tools prior to this situation. And in some cases, people haven't. You know, the rain came, they decided to plant quickly, and there's been really no review of things other than maybe a few rules of thumb have been applied about say phosphorus rates and things like that, where we're just putting replacement on. But we're going to play the game as far as trace elements, nitrogen, sulfur, things that we can amend in crop. We've still got some flexibility, and how we're going to know when to act and what to do. So as I said, there's a range of tools out there. I want to talk mostly about deep in crop N and some of the considerations that need to be taken into account. I'll have some comments on nutrient-rich strips, which are becoming more popular in some areas, and technology is evolving in helping to understand what those things mean and how to act on that basis, and some of the stuff around plant tissue testing and how it relates to proximal sensing. So talking in this space about what these are and how they fit in. So, you know, they've all got a fairly big window, but really to use them best, we should be very careful about where we apply them, because, you know, you can do some of these things that are too late. And particularly where we're talking about nitrogen and sulfur, then our window is to do something sometime between the end of tillering or mid to late tillering and Z31, Z32, because this is the stage where we can influence the nitrogen greatly if we get it right, and the rainfall patterns are kind to us. Plenty of data coming through from southern Australia, and I will make this point, southern Australia, where there is generally follow-up rain in spring, that you can grow crops early on, particularly up towards the end of tillering, mid-tillering to later tillering, quite deficient. They can look quite yellow and quite emaciated. And we can recover all of that during the Z30 to 39 stage, provided we have enough tillers by the end of tillering to produce you know, the crop. So if we've got trace element problems, as we've said in the past, then we're talking usually about youngest expanded blades, and we're talking about before it starts to tiller. So we're getting 4 through to 8 leaf type stage, and we're looking at the most useful part of the plant being young expanded blade. But there's a range of other things in there. Deep in crop N, you can look at what the plant's taking up, or you can look at the soil early on. The thing with deep in crop N is really by the time you get through to mid-tillering, you should have your decision made to do something over here. So it's an early, from the time it's sown right through to mid to late tillering is the time to do that. But after then, you're really talking about difficulty in getting the samples out without damaging the crop, particularly once you start to get into the noding stage. Enriched strips, relevant right across, but really the later part of this is about whether we get more than one option during the season, whether it's a Z32, Z37 or flag leaf type application to influence protein, as to whether we would, continue on the enriched strip approach right through. But it doesn't hurt to see how long it lasts, and there's some rules about how you might do that and how you interpret it. We've got flag leaf opportunities if the season is really going for us with plant tissue analysis to interpret that. And that's actually sampling the flag leaf itself for nitrogen. There is some interpretation data for that. Just one of the ones that's important if we're closely monitoring is tiller counts. Still very, still very relevant, largely. And the other one is proximal and remoted crop density or greenness indices. A lot of them are going to hit the market in the next 12 or 18 months with their proprietary algorithms to give you an interpretation. Whether they all line up will be interesting to see, and that's possibly a good reason to do some of the good old ones to see whether they're lining up in saying the same thing. So in looking at deep in-crop N, there's a few things that we need to consider if we're going to do, or we're still going to do this. And some of those include timing. When are you going to do it? Because that really does influence some of the decisions you're going to have to make about, one, the efficiency with which that nitrogen will be used, and two, whether you need to include some charge against the soil or some credit against the soil as it comes up when you're doing the calculations for the nitrogen the crop has already got in it at the time that you sample. So the later we go, the closer we get to Z30, we're getting on to the possibility of having of 20% of the dry matter that the plant's going to grow in total present above ground, which means it contains nitrogen that's already been taken up that we don't need to add again between there and crop maturity. So we may need to account for that, because in whole tops up until then we're looking at about 5% nitrogen in the whole tops. So if we've got 500 kilos of dry matter, then we're going to have 25 kilograms of nitrogen sitting in there already. Is that enough to say I need to take that off? Or is that just something we'll say that's up my sleeve and I'll just put it on? That's a decision you need to make, and that comes out of the timing. Secondly, the later we go and the closer we get to the Z30, Z31 stage, the higher the nitrogen efficiency. So of the nitrogen we're putting on, if we put it on just after sowing, before the crop had really got away, if we sample then and put it on, then we're really looking at not much of a root system and an efficiency that would be really equivalent to a late pre-plant soil sampling, and how we would interpret that. And we're talking generally nitrogen use efficiencies of around 40%. As we get closer to the Z30, we know that nitrogen applied at that stage in concert with the nitrogen that's being supplied by the crop averages around 60% efficiency. So you're going to gain 50% efficiency by having a root system there that when the nitrogen goes on and we get water washing it into the root zone, you get quite rapid uptake. And it's a lot more efficient than if it's sitting around and getting washed deeper or being lost through any denitrification event that could happen early. So timing's important, and they're the two major things that it affects in a deep in-crop N. Sampling depth is another one. Do I take total N? Do I do the N to the total depth of the soil? And do I do it in one increment, say do 0 to 90 or 0 to 60? Again, it depends on what you understand of the season. In the south, I would generally only do 0 to 60, and if I have some knowledge, there might be nitrogen bulges either in the surface or down deep, I might look at 2 increments. But in the north, because you know, you're going to get limited opportunities to top dress, you're probably just going to look down to a 90 and possibly in 2 increments. For me, it's 0 to 60 and 60 to 90, and the 60 to 90 says what's down there if we end up with a drying in spring, what nitrogen's down there for the crop to mature on, particularly late. It's going to influence protein. So that's going to give you a bit of knowledge. But generally, the important part is 0 to 60. If you're going to sample any depth at all, if you've only got one opportunity, that's where I'd be looking. Even in the north, because that's the depth that's going to affect yield. The 60 to 90 is going to affect protein mostly. The other thing you've got to have awareness of is any sources of banded nitrogen prior to sampling, because that's, or particularly at sampling, because if you're sampling just afterwards and you haven't had a lot of rain, and we've got clayey type soils, if it's not in sand, then you're going to have bands there that you need to avoid or you need to take into account in your sampling protocol. And this frequently can stuff people up in crop deep ends, is having end source bands there, either from ammonium phosphate, particularly DAP, or where someone's banded some urea, double shot urea and DAP through their planting rig. Then we've got to be careful of where that might be. We've got to understand, and I've already had this question from somebody in the last week or so, crop residues, what particularly where we've had a dry summer and not much breakdown of residues, and there was incorporation of those residues, particularly those from cereal crops, quite rapid into moist soil just post pre-sowing, when they were trying to get rid of some stubble to actually get the stowing operations. Now that's going to, based on, if you do the look around from all of the research, would suggest it's going to tie up between 5 and 10 kilograms of N per tonne for wheat stubble. And I'll put in there different stubbles and different plant parts have different, what we call C to N ratios that tie up the nitrogen. So you can see there's the roots tend to break down faster because they have a lower C to N ratio relative to the whole plant, which is this top information here. So you can see wheat, for this particular measurement, it was 60 to 1 in the tops and around 40 to 1 in the roots. And that's why it's quite common if you go out there in the paddock and you pull up the plant when it's late in the fallow. The stubble above ground is still there, but the roots have mostly disappeared because it doesn't take as much nitrogen in the soil to break down the carbon and the bugs to respire it as it does with the tops. So when we turn the tops in, we can end up with this sort of thing happening. Now, the question is, do we take account of that when we're talking about in-crop testing? Because this is not necessarily, if we've got stubble still breaking down when we sample, this process hasn't completed, and do we need to allow for it? So it depends on the intensity, this type of stubble, the C to N ratio as to how intense this might be, the quantity that was there to begin with, and the amount of that quantity that was incorporated. But if we took 10 kilograms and we got 20% incorporation of a 10-ton stubble, then we've got 20 or 30 kilograms of N likely being tied up. Now that might be enough to cause some problems later on if we don't allow for it, particularly in a better season, when we're relying on mineralization of organic nitrogen to actually help us through that spring period of rapid uptake of N. The other thing will be the seasonal conditions that happen during between when it was incorporated and when we're testing. So if it's been dry this is going to be greater than and may not have reached its equilibrium point than if it's been wet, because we turn it in and then get dry condition. It just sits there as a possibility as soon as it gets wet. So, you know, that's another consideration. Do we allow for that when we're in crop, and particularly if we've put stubble into the ground just prior to sowing so we could sow, or it's been incorporated by the sowing application. In crop N, soil mineral N, what quantity and what location? You know, in particular, you know, what's there in the top, as I said, the top 60 centimeters is what's important. Top 30, not too worried about, because the top 30, if the soil profiles start out as reasonably full, then the roots will start producing uptake below 30 centimeters fairly quickly. So where's the mineral nitrogen relative to the moisture? And if we've got 60 centimeters of moisture and we've got the topsoil a little bit low, I generally don't worry too much, because as I said, with wheat and those crops, they appear to be able to take some early nitrogen deficiency. And as long as there's enough there from Z30 on, they will compensate. Further north, a bit more of an issue, but it's not just what's there, but where is it? The other thing to think about is what's the... That's not an evacuation, that's my phone going off. The other one is what's the likely contribution of the humic and labile fraction? So if the stubble wasn't wheat, it was peas and they didn't actually yield too much, or chickpeas, and it was dry, and in spring we get rain, is that labile, the leaves breaking down? Have they broken down, or are they going to suddenly give a hit and we're going to see 14 or 15 kilograms a week of N become available in spring? Probably if we ignore it, it'll probably contribute to better than we thought yields and higher proteins. That's probably not a problem. But if people are cash strapped and they're wanting to account for all the bit and you know, not spend too much on the crop, then we probably got to account for that. So, you know, that's a consideration in a discussion with the farmer as to whether, you know, how that plays in and at what level that's relevant. And the last bit, as it related to, you know, the timing of doing this is, you know, when we put on the nitrogen, what's the crop stage and what's the relative nitrogen use efficiency, which I said, it changes, you know, from sowing right through to flag leaf. We have this bell-shaped curve where we have an optimum around Z30 to about Z34. And then from there, particularly after flag leaf, where we get some pollen and we start to get some, I suppose, resources put into the head rather than into growing dry matter, we start to lose some, and there's a change in the hormonal status of the plant to start to say the roots have done their job, we're not going to allocate them too much. We start to end up with relatively the roots being sacrificed and nitrogen uptake starting to wane. So they're the considerations for in-crop deep N, as I would see them. And the question is, do I account for those things, or do I just do it on face value? And all of those unders and overs will take care of themselves. And we'll just do what we won't worry about accounting for those. It's up to you. I'm just pointing out some of the areas and the sizes of adjustments that may need to be made in coming up with a deep end strategy off a soil test. Another option that's graining possibility, and we, I suppose, at Back Paddock, we haven't pursued this to the end point as yet, but now with some of the changes that we can that are in place that Chris will show you, we can probably pursue this as another option that we can provide, which is the simple nutrient-rich strip. So this is just putting in what we used to call a test strip, and looking at it across the season and seeing whether the extra nutrient that we put on, somewhere usually in the 50 to 100% of what we put on the rest of the paddock, is continuing to produce a better crop outcome than what we necessarily did as the background. And it becomes the guide for test strip. The test strip becomes the guide for what we might do in crop if they get too far apart for the season. Now, the next part of this is really coming down to, with the availability of, we can do it manually, either visually, or we can start to use things like NDVI devices to actually measure the difference in greenness and crop density to get an objective measurement of what the difference is. So if there's no differences between the strips, nothing to be done. If there is a difference, then we've got to make a decision. What are we going to do about it, and when, and at what point do we do something about it? The basics, generally this will be done for nitrogen or something you can do in crop. And the best calibrations for the NDVI driven ones are for nitrogen. And I imagine there probably are working on people working on hyperspectral imaging and calibration to other nutrients, but I would suggest that really relevance as far as influencing the crops are going to probably remain with N and S principally, and maybe K for some soils in Western Australia, particularly the sandy soils that do respond to in-crop application of K. So you can have two interpretation options. You can have what I call summative sequential addition, and that's basically based on best guess. You know what rate you put on in the rest of the paddock. You know what you put in the N-rich strip. So you just add something in between, and on the best guess of what's enough. The other one that's available, and it takes some interpretation, is the calibrated NDVI-based model. And I've got an example there of one where you can actually go to this website and create your own calibration. There's one that someone's done for Esperance in Western Australia. It's not difficult really to calibrate. It takes a couple of seasons to get the variability under control and to come up with a stable model. But, it's really just using the time after planting and the NDVI factors that you get from the scaling of best to worst in the paddock, or the enriched strip versus the normal paddock. And the district maximum yield, and it gives you an output and actually will calibrate it for N rate. And if you want to optimize that, you can do some things around price of grain and fertilizer. So those tools are being developed, and as I said, we'll be looking at those for the future now that we've got access to NDVI data to be able to help with that. And that sort of points to this whole thing of directed sampling. With the availability of reasonable scale and basically fairly widespread free access to NDVI, proximally or remotely sensed, then we can start to look at directing samples on the farm to where they're most useful, rather than waiting for symptoms to occur. As I said, using previous year's data and going back to those sites because they're known to be issues in most crops, or we can get a feeling for where patches are occurring in the crop and going and investigating those. So this is the type of thing that Chris is going to be talking about, but it's pretty important when if you're talking about in-crop sampling, in which case particularly you'd have to have obviously a reasonable amount of vegetation to do that with soil sampling. But for plant tissue in its sweet spot around the start of tillering through to Z30, these sort of maps are pretty much filled in. You've got enough canopy there to get reasonable resolution of differences. And you can start to use this to do what I'd call directed sampling as to where you're going to take samples and why. So when we're talking about plant tissue sampling, there's basically some rules, and you know, that analogy I said at the start is particularly important for plant tissue because, you know, unlike soil testing, the calibrations don't lead you to calculations for rate. There are very, very few algorithms that actually have been established that can tell you a plant tissue sample at this date will give you a rate of this amount to optimize yield. It's not like soil sampling. So we use it as a piece of information to confirm what the plant has taken up relative to what the soil sample said it should have taken, or it potentially could take up. So it's involving the roots as a sampling for the for what nutrients are available relative to what the soil said should be available. So the rules are that you need to be careful and set a set of guidelines for yourself when you establish what the purpose is. So is it prediction of a impending problem, and I need to come up with a rate? Is it monitoring change? And I think the biggest value of plant tissue sampling is around monitoring change. When you change the program in the soil, a soil test will not tell you very quickly that when you leave phosphorus off, the crop is likely to have a problem. Soil tests run down over years. If the plant is having a problem because you didn't put starter P on, the plant will tell you faster than the soil test will. So if we go from a situation where people want to start to think about, should I add a nutrient and is it making a difference, or should I leave a nutrient out because it's reached adequacy in my my budgeting, then the plant will tell you a lot faster than the soil will. And so monitoring changes to programs is the prime consideration. Troubleshooting is always out there, but there's lots of issues with troubleshooting because you can make a lot of mistakes if it's not done properly. And the other one is cross calibration. If we're going to a new technology, is what it's saying lining up with what the old tools are saying? Hopefully it will, but it probably pays to be a little bit careful, and there's a period of cross calibration. So when you pick that, know the limitations, the interpretation criteria before sampling. So pick the right one for the right reason and know that you've got data. And I've just put an example down here of, you know, where online of, you know, the types of information we provide as to guide people for particular crops, which stage and what plant part, and approximately how much of that plant part you'll need to get a representative sample to the lab. And, you know, remember, it's not like soil. Soils, generally, when we sample them, have got somewhere around the 20 or maybe 30% in wet soil of moisture. Plants are 90% moisture. So if we send in 50 grams, the lab ends up with 5 grams of dried material to work with. Not enough for a comprehensive analysis. So, you know, think about it. 200 grams is 20 grams. That's adequate. And for the lab to have a QA sample there sitting and something goes wrong. But if you send in too little, then they can't complete the sample, complete the number of analysis that you might have requested. And 2, if something goes wrong, they may not have enough QA sample to resurrect it. Sampling protocol, line it up with your interpretation. Understand the effect of crop condition on sampling results. So don't sample outside a window when there are known things that are going to influence the results. Use the same subsampling rules as for soil. If there's paddock variability there, you've got to decide whether you're going to sample the soil separately, the areas separately because they are distinctly different, or are you going to take just a simple transect across? In which case, monitoring change, if it's just on a paddock basis, and there are no differences in eyeball growth, then you know it may be just subsampling is just getting enough material from enough points to incorporate a small amount of variability that might be there. But use the same sort of subsampling rules as you would use for soil. Beware of contamination. Remember, plant samples are total analysis. They are hit with a very strong acid, which will solubilize every bit of nutrient that's on the leaf as well as what's in it. And we're really wanting to know what's in the leaf, not what's on it. So be careful of contamination. Dust is a common one, but there can be some contamination from hands during sampling if you're not careful. Remember, it's perishable in transit. Look after it. And remember, all of these samples are live samples of, by and large, so there is potential for biosecurity, whether that's what's in it as a disease or what's on it as a pest. Most labs have protocols in place with the state departments about importing materials, but just be careful. Every now and then, like New South Wales a couple of years ago, we had a lupin anthracnose outbreak that happened mid-season, and there was a lockdown on those going into state. You can get caught up, and just be aware of those sort of things with biosecurity. We don't want to be, when you're doing the right thing of increasing the potential for a problem of a disease or a pest getting out into state through the plant samples. So yeah, that's typical. Most labs will have sampling guides for the winter cereals, which we're particularly talking about now, or a large range of crops. These are put in place, and they are quite specific because these relate to the critical levels that are appropriate to use for the plant part and the plant stage. So if you're outside that, then there's an extra bit of interpretation of the data that's got to be done. When we're talking about interpretation, we've got to be careful with things like whole tops. This is a graph of the growth stage versus nitrogen and the drop off and the change that happens at Z30. This is related to the dilution curve, that basically 80% or 60% of the dry matter occurs between Z30 and Z37. And you can see the steep rate of dilution that's happening, which is dropping off the dry matter dilution, that's dropping off the nitrogen concentration, or the critical nitrogen concentration. So look, that's the danger zone in there. We're sampling for nitrogen as far as whole tops, because it's dropping that rapidly. You've got to be very precise about the growth stage to be able to interpret it. Youngest expanded leaf you can see here, not subject to the same thing because we've got the same plant part. But when sampling youngest expanded blade, be very careful that you sample leaf blades that are the same age and about the same size, and from the primary tiller. Don't take it from secondary tillers. The temptation is to, because it's easier to collect the youngest expanded blades from multiple tillers, but tillers being later have a different stage. So we can end up with a mash-up in here if we don't take it the same and identify for youngest expanded blade, a lot more stable, but need to make sure it's coming from the primary tiller. The problem with whole tops for nitrogen is this growth dilution, and we're making some progress in coming up with a what's called a nitrogen nutrient index, or a nutrient index type approach, which looks at biomass at a particular time versus the concentration. And by doing that, it takes out the dry matter dilution as a factor. But if there is no dry matter dilution, and we're just looking at, we're just looking at a straight curve, just a normal dilution curve, we can use phenology. But if there's something that's a problem, like a good versus poor one, where we're troubleshooting, then this approach of whole tops and phenology as a trigger for what the critical level comes undone, because it's the plant size and the concentration that decides whether it's adequate or not. So this is in vogue in Western Australia. It is the way most of it's done over there. but there's some opportunity, particularly for nitrogen, to be able to implement that in the near future for situations where people are troubleshooting. And then we've got the straight old lookup tables that says if it's less than this value, it's deficient. Various approaches, just know which one you're using and when and why, and you'll get a lot more success and a lot more satisfaction. So where are the interpretation data? There's a heap of stuff on the internet. There's public references, so there's reference text, there's internet sites. This is WA from the department, but you're going to have to go through a lot of those to find enough information to fill in the whole thing. There's apps. We've just recently released Wheat PTI, which is based on this model here, that the phenology drives the critical levels, and it's basically an app where you can put in the plant part, the growth stage, and the nutrient concentrations, and it'll give you an adequacy index quite quickly for those nutrients. Also, there's private labs, and there's labs, there's fertilizer companies, and there's other subscription DSS that'll produce these sorts of reports for you and automate it for you. So look, there's a range of it, and it's about which one's right for you in the context and what support you get in developing the recommendations if it's a bit unclear. So there's a range of tools out there to do plant analysis. What I recommend is that you find yourself a process and define yourself a process, even if it's just a mental process of the sampling, what's my protocol, which lab do I use, and then in particular, which interpretation system am I going to use? Because that will give you a lot more consistency in using plant tissue, and then putting that in context with all that primary source data that we talked about up the front here, that important considerations, put the plant test data with that, use a truth test. Is it confirming or saying something different, and move forward with a bit more confidence.